And welcome to Game Master's Guide. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and tonight on Game Master's Soapbox, I am going to be going on a bit of a tear. And what I'm going to be talking about are the things that people are going to be talking about tomorrow. I've always considered myself to be a bit of a trailblazer, a front runner, so to speak, but there's always the possibility that instead I'm running far behind the curve. And so today I'm going to be basically going over all of the perceptions that I have about the games industry, not only today, but also tomorrow and the future of the games business, in particular the tabletop role-playing game community. I'm looking forward to some insightful commentary and perhaps some castigation. If my views are way off, I'd love to hear about it. If you see what I'm saying as being spot on, I'd love to hear about it as well. So before we get started, make sure you go down below and let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and let's go to it.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
So when you are in a role-play game environment, of course, you're going to be sort of cutting edge right from the get-go. The very concept of playing a role-playing game is in many cases avant-garde and seen as out there or strange. And while there has been some major uplift through TV programs like Stranger Things or Critical Role or even Community back in the day, so to speak, these are only elevation, if you will, of a fringe. And so who I'm talking to and who I'm wanting to talk with are those people who have already embraced role-playing and tabletop role-playing games. I'm going to ask that you look at the things that I'm saying, give me some honest feedback on where they are and where our future is, because I perceive of something that has sort of made itself evident throughout the last decade or two, and that has everything to do with the very concept of social media and YouTube in particular, and that is the concept of the algorithm, the mechanism that chooses which videos are shown to what audience and why. And we're going to be talking a little bit about trend setting as well as trend following, and where I perceive the games business and the tabletops environment in particular moving to, not only with an eye towards going forward, but how we've gotten to where we've gotten to so far. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the sophistication of role-playing games. When we look at the history of it, the game was much more simplified and not nearly as challenging in terms of understanding. Now, a caveat to that is, of course, there is the development of a specific language and lingo which allows for a perceived value and importance because you are either part of the in crowd or you aren't. But the concepts have gone way beyond that. We are looking at a time period that I'm seeing the concept now of having these things that used to be a part of the mechanism by nature now being sort of externally enforced. And this trend, I think, is a bad thing, and I will explain why. When we speak of, for example, the idea of improvised drama, when you are observing a show like Critical Role or other orchestrated adventure game in an online environment, whether it's fully scripted or whether it is simply gone over with a fine-tooth comb by the players to make sure that they have the right beats and the right answers to the question, so to speak, this creates an improvised mechanism that really isn't there. It's sort of like watching a reality TV program compared to watching a scripted program. The idea of the reality show or the improvised role-play drama is that you are enforcing things that feel like one-to-one real relationships, but instead are mechanized and automated and streamlined and focus group defined. And this problem with improvised drama is it takes away the viewer's understanding. One of the ways, for example, that happens is in the very tempo of the speech pattern of a presenter like me. I've got a lot of information to cover, and I try to make it as well reasoned as possible, but my delivery is not rapid fire. I don't put an enforcement in my voice that demands understanding and demands your attention. And so therefore I can understand why some people will take a video of mine and watch about 3 minutes and say, well, that's all you can take. I get it. And that is probably always going to be the case. And so really, as a trendsetter, you'll see one of the later videos in this series, it talks exactly about this issue. But beyond that, let me stay in this idea of sophistication. The idea that what is acceptable behavior is being streamlined and modified and declared in the rules mechanisms fundamentally creates a galvanization of culture. Whether you are outside of the culture and therefore seen as pariah, or if you are inside the culture and have certain expectancies placed upon you, both of them are, again, an arbitrary framework, a structural coherence that is problematic. If you look at, for example, the concept of saying you must be a certain class to pick up this certain skill, or you have to have this certain function to gain this certain ability, you're depriving the players of the creativity that might be established when they do the what if mechanisms and look at what might be. But you're also lining up a series of resolutions that are then being externally defined about what is proper and what is not. The irony is that the very persons that are developing this propriety are hiding behind the boundaries of saying that the rules are being fair and equitable, but the very mechanism itself is enforcing a mechanism. This leads, unfortunately, to the very idea that someone becomes a victim and is seen as a hero because they are the victim, and that problem is established well in role-playing games over the last decade as they have altered and changed from what they were to what they are now. And this is done in the name of breaking the continuity. Instead of holding to what always was, it's being redefined so that it is now a different framework and a different paradigm, but that different paradigm is not come to by logic and understanding. Instead, it's being established and foisted upon the community. And this air of sophistication is elevated to, and it has, to me, or at least to my understanding, the very concept that we are, as players, seen as avant-garde, as seen as leaders and guides, and therefore we are now being held to frameworks that were not, by their definition, independently chosen, but instead were arbitrarily enforced. The next, of course, is the idea of complexifying something. I know that's a fancy way of saying it. It's a bigger word, and it was intentionally so. But the idea is that if you complexify a system, then those who are in the know are esteemed to be wiser and more intelligent because they are in the know. Whereas if they are outside of that equation, then they are seen as ignorant and perhaps unaware of the possibilities, and therefore are less wise. And this complexity, this over-complexification, as I said, is really a result of looking at the mechanisms of the game and attempting to redefine them so that the terminology that once had a certain meaning is now being overrun by another. One limited example is the very concept of the campaign. We had a conversation several videos ago about the establishment of your adventure group's process, and there are 10 different ones. I've got a video on the 10 different styles of GM groups, and I'll put that in this video linked here. But The 10 different styles are simply a process, and when you then redefine a campaign to mean a completely different mechanism, then you undermine the value of those who are making other suggestions, but you also take away the very mechanisms that would let you improve your game session. The idea of running a campaign or whatever and mandating a certain timing, tempo, mechanistic elevation of things within the game take away player agency and enforce instead an external expectation that in many cases can't even be achieved. This fundamentally is tantamount to providing a whole bunch of red herrings to your groups without meaning to, simply because you can't provide them with a solid, coherent storyline, because that would be somehow mechanistically incongruent. It wouldn't fit with what the story elements should be, again, by this external force defined. Next, we have to talk about the overt attempt that's being foisted or advanced upon the adventure games and the TTRPG universe to fundamentally get rid of game masters. I do know that there are people who have developed elements and mechanisms that allow them to play at role play because they are still experiencing their perceived understanding of what that role play game is, but they're no longer advancing a story or even trying to develop a story, because to them the story itself is irrelevant. And one of the biggest mechanisms that would do that would be an artificial intelligence replacing the storyteller. If a mechanism simply blurted out a series of actions that you must accomplish in order to finish the story, it isn't necessarily building a coherent pathway, but simply creating a flow through that matches the conventions of conversation. And the additional mechanisms of this are set up, if you will, to try to get rid of an arbitrary external judge on the system. And there are so many different reasons why this would be attractive in this new developing environment. You would have fundamentally conflict-free roleplay, because you wouldn't be focusing on the elements that are so dynamic in current roleplay games like the destruction of monsters and such. Instead, you're going to deal with the intrinsic doctrinal differences between participants, and therefore you no longer have the possibility or probability of character elimination. It simply isn't going to happen in this kind of a role-play environment. Furthermore, you've got this outreach into an understanding of sensitivity and acknowledgement that everyone seems to be trying to reach for, that will automatically expand if there's no game master to say, let's get back to the story at hand. Instead, the micro dramas gain a level of emphasis that is arguably, whether it's warranted or unwarranted, problematic to a role-play game in its traditional form. In addition, you have the increase of societal drama when players can actually, I wouldn't say, I guess the word I'm looking for is impose. When the players within a game system can impose their own personal drama upon the other players and require the other players to interact not only with the individual, but this contrived experience that's being defined. You are getting away from the person actually role-playing, but instead you are looking at basically psychological debriefing and in some cases therapeutic interactions. And that is not the purview of the unprofessional. The idea of a professional counselor handling those kind of things in a role-play environment may be good within the setting of the professional's environment, but not in the play environment, because this need to be conscientious of what others hold or feel or establish within their own framework only becomes important when the entire conversation now focuses on it instead of on the actual interactions themselves. And all of these lend themselves to moving outside of the objectives of a game master, because you're now replacing the very dynamics of the role-play game with something else that does not require their presence. And this is, in a word, problematic for all of the game masters in the world and anybody who actually has a focus on the story elements rather than the player elements. Now, there's also an ongoing war, if you will, focusing on this concept of transparency. The first of which, of course, is if a game master himself holds any view that is of a challenge of any nature to the players, they have the capacity to simply nullify them, just simply negate them and say, you can't be the storyteller anymore because you're not fitting the framework that we have as a group agreed to. And this, ironically, drives out the very agents that you really want to be running and administering your role-play games. Now, I know that this by itself is going to be one of the sticking points, and certainly my position is going to be challenged on terms of other parts of this. But the concept that the GM must, by definition, be transparent to all of his players is one of those practical impossibilities that will inevitably lead to a downfall of any and every storyteller. And I believe that's fundamentally part of the mechanistic demand for it. This need to have our personal choice of values and virtues validated is a problem also, because there are some of them that are quite toxic and dangerous and lead down inexorable roads that are going to cause us problems. This idea of the player's personal interactional needs becoming paramount actually will drive out the idea of individual scoring purposes and individual advancement opportunities, and lead ultimately to the idea of participation promotion. Just as the school system that has been socially promoting children beyond their capacity to truly compete with their peers has led to the school systems and being in the mess that they are in, and are going to be leading us down that same path when we automatically advance everyone without their interaction. And the idea of player promotion really should be at the hands of the players, and the need for them to become more than what they are becomes a imposition on them as players. Now, the next challenge of this very process of transparency is that it tends to dampen the conclusions and outcomes of the game session, because you cannot go back and readdress the challenge portions, because that itself is now being seen as incendiary and off-putting and challenging. And instead of allowing us to embrace those disparities and acknowledge where the challenge comes from, and embracing what might be the good changes, the good things that could happen, instead we're being pressed to simplify and weaken our personal resolve and the player character resolve as well. And even the very concept of redefining the meaning, if we look at reasons and rationales such as religions and philosophies, in a role-play game, those are now being set aside and not being deemed as valued or important, but instead the conclusion is now outstripping the justification aspect, and that is therefore leading to a situation where the transparency requirements are becoming themselves opaque and problematic. Now, there's been a change also in the very argument about what the game masters are for. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. The idea that the very concept of what story is being told by the game master is systemically challenging, but systematically being eliminated. The idea that the story has value is being castigated session after session by some players because they don't want there to be a structure, or they don't want there to be a conclusive good, bad, right, wrong. They simply just want the point system to continue to advance them. And this also feeds into another challenge, and that is that players, because they are so used to the video games marketplace where they can actually play the single character in a story and everybody else becomes non-player personas to them, means that there are such isolation demands on the gameplay that the game master fundamentally is having to run 6 different games at the same time and having every player pursue their own course instead of them all looking at the possibilities and determining which one we're going to pursue next. The elevation of the individual has led to there being a lot of game masters who run one-person stories. They literally GM for a single friend of theirs because that's all they can get together that can play together, because each individual has such a strong agenda that it's impossible for them to run groups. And this element that somehow the player's story matters more than the other stories at the table really has led us to becoming fundamentally antisocial. Now, I'm saying, I realize I should go ahead and say again that I'm saying all this from my perspective, and not everyone perhaps has the same experience. But I'm speaking in the larger terms, and I believe that other game masters and other YouTubers and influencers and such are going to be talking about these subjects in the near future. And I think that my position here will be borne out, that the concept of the story matters more, my story matters more than the overall great story, will therefore eventually undermine and eliminate the very concepts of other storylines, so that the player story will become the mainstay, and it will become a dominion of action magnets, that every player will see that they need to be in every scene, or else they won't be able to forward their agenda, because the scenes that they are not in would be providing, if you will, fan service to a story other than their own. Now this is going to be also in addition to the aforementioned shout down, as I've said several different times before. One of the biggest challenges of a games group is learning how to speak in terms so that every player gets a chance to put in their own 2 cents and to become part of the decision-making process. Not that each person has to be it's not like I'm saying that your adventure must be a vote by committee, but the idea of getting the word in edgewise for the less experienced player is much more important. And so we have to get rid of the shouting down mechanism, because the shout down, as it becomes more normalized, the less likely players will continue, and you'll be again running for 1 or 2 players of whom their own story will be of higher paramount objectives than and purpose than your own. Alrighty, and also I want to talk next about the idea of professionalism and what professionalism is doing and can do. And so I want to talk a little bit about player revolution. That sounds like a good thing to say. Oh, we need to be revolutionary, and we need to be dynamic, and every player for themselves. And there is something to be said about that, but the player revolution really needs to be an orchestrated and designed thing, including game masters. And this concept of overrunning the storyteller and overwriting what the story developer had in mind is really no different than trying to play a video game with a perma hack on that damages the outcome and undervalues the player dynamics that were built into the game. the reality is that there are more moving parts in a role-playing game than most would recognize, and a GM organized player revolution is a good thing because he's guiding the players towards an improvement of their play experience. But when that move is made without the game master, it undermines and undervalues the very mechanisms that would have supported their actions. Now, this does lead fundamentally to the very concept of a three-body problem. You have a hard time picking a quality game master and a dynamic, strong game-playing group and a compelling and interesting non-linear story. Those pieces seem to always be in some sort of a mismatch, and it's difficult to focus all of them together. But this challenge can be overcome with a level of professionalism. Just as a GM-driven player revolution, the three-body problem can fall into a more comprehensible place when the game master is working with the players to come up with the compelling story that they all can appreciate and enjoy. Now, the biggest challenge, of course, is that this flies in the face of our own meme culture, for lack of a better term. The idea of the selfish gene is that we pick up and put down the information that we want to be replicated in the conversation, and sometimes that's useful and sometimes that's harmful. And being able to identify when those pieces of our personality that come out in the roleplay game are harmful, we're not clearly able to identify them, and even our understanding of where we are in the mechanism can sort of have a Dunning-Kruger effect, that somehow you can not know all that you could know and therefore think that what you know is more than enough. And this problem begins to develop almost a focus of narcissism, the idea that the cost of a justification to do something in a game can become strong enough to actually override the other players at the table, can itself lead to even more problems. And the idea is that as we get more professional, as we get the dynamics of role play into a meaningful fashion, we have to be careful not to overplay or over extenuate those circumstances that would lead us to additional problems. So the question is, does that mean this is the end of the world? That I'm prophesying the end of role-playing games as an entirety? Am I suggesting that we're not going to have cool games going forward? Well, obviously not. The role-playing environment, like it or not, is going to constantly exist. The idea of a person who wants to tell a story, relating the story in such a way that the other players at the table can interact and be a part of it, and it can be a shared experience to build an even more rich environment, will always be the case. There are always going to be those rogue world builders who, regardless of what they're being told, build the world they want to create and give that to their players in whatever mechanism that they are using. It doesn't matter whether they're formalizing it and using the Dungeons and Dragons mechanism itself, or if they are hiding behind the boundaries of a new and interesting system such as Nikos RPG, or if they are using a contrivance mechanism that helps to reinforce those necessary evils back into the game, such as Dragonheart. The idea is that these outliers and exceptions to standard rules are always going to give us a place to play that will make our play better. There will be those groups that create in a vacuum. There are tons of people who buy a role-playing game at a role-playing store one time and simply make do with that. As I've said before, my role-playing expertise started when I had no polyhedral dice and I had to develop my own mechanisms because they were not there, and use standard six-siders to create the same charts. The idea that the creation in a vacuum can create dynamic and wonderful tools is evidenced every day with a new launch that comes out and we go, there's something interesting about that game mechanism. And as a matter of fact, there's even those games that operate within a framework that defy understanding, and I call it the Bumblebee Principle. There are simply games that have a great storyteller, a great group of players that are willing to interact with that person, and they can play week after week without having any challenges or hesitations because the game mechanism works for them. Now, I believe in the long run, this will lead to an ultimate rise of the rebels. That, yes, those people who are revolting against the mechanisms that are out there will find the way. They will find the tools that will work for them. And so, therefore, the end of the worlds only are really the opening of doors to the new possibilities. Now, I'm going to talk about, for a moment, the projection of hope, right? There's always a possibility, and I'm going to talk about some things that I believe are going to be the mechanisms for this change. Whether they strike now or whether they strike later, I'm calling them out because I've seen these things as in terms of a prognostication. And while I might be ahead of the curve or I might be behind the curve, nonetheless, these are going to be the topics that are going to be talked about in the next few days. One of them is, of course, the release of Daggerheart. And I did a video on the Daggerheart phenomenon, and I ran a demo of it, and that link will be put here. And there also will be the upcoming launch of Nikos RPG in the next week or so. I've mentioned it before, but there's going to be a video for that. That'll be linked here as well. And then, of course, there are isolated other games. There are a couple of companies on the East Coast of which I just recently became interested that also show intriguing opportunities for creativity that aren't found anywhere else. And I would recommend that you take a look at some of those. I'll try to put some links in for those videos also. I also believe that there's a big opportunity right now in role-playing game development that comes from the very AI crisis, because as the concept of creativity becomes questioned and the materials that a person develops becomes blurred, it's going to be more and more important that the individuals who are creative and are willing to step out need to do so they can be seen. That doesn't mean that the tools are not available for use in other fashions that might be able to guide or not necessarily guide, but to monitor and adjust the messages in more efficient ways. But the opportunities are there. Finally, there will always be the opportunity for the free play environments, and as a matter of fact, there's been a considerable rise in the lit RPG community as they strive to fill in the gaps of identity between that which is game and that which is novel and that which is written for consumption in that format and that which is intended to be played out in a game mechanism. In either which way, we're looking at a world that has huge opportunities in front of it, and I implore you that you provide yourself and list in the comments for us what you are doing and how you see the games environment advancing in the future. Now, where the rubber really meets the road is that we really need to play games for the fun of it. We need to perhaps get down off of our high horses and not see the dangers in the games environment as great as we think them to be. We need to have we need to clear our minds of the lack of awareness of the challenges that are here. We need to get our head out of the sand and recognize that there are some problems in the mechanisms that currently exist, and there is some opportunity for changing up and altering the process. Perhaps we are really worried about our own need to change. We're afraid of it, and so we become reticent in our aggressiveness against something that is problematic. We allow that problem to grow in an uncomfortable silence as we refuse to face against it. There's also, of course, that people talk a lot about the fear of missing out, and that is definitely a part of the trend following mechanism. But I believe there's also a section that we're going to be talking about in the future, and perhaps this is the beginning of that we need to avoid the fear of creativity, because the lack of knowledge of what's available is, of course, on us, but it's also a lack of ignorance that plagues the world of creativity because we're not allowing the innovation that might come from the awareness thereof. And this concept has grown to the point where there is definitely a complex interactivity that occurs between the game master and the player, where it's a dance of what is allowed and what is not allowed, what's permissible, what's not permissible, what is taboo and what is not. And this can be overcome by undermining this complexity and really looking at the risk and reward imbalance and saying, what is it that makes the game fun? What is it that makes the game challenging? And where can we make the lines in such a way that we're not merely virtue signaling and getting the attention that we want from the quote right people, and instead look at what is proper for the majority of the players at the table, and how do we embrace this more open creativity that is available. Now, all of this leads down to the mechanistic changes, and so I'm going to ask you to all consider the concept of roleplay roulette. Now, many of you play roleplay games and have a static, routine, established way of play, and that's great, but I'm going to recommend that you look at the concept of rolling roleplay roulette simply to get a flavor change in the genre of the story, and therefore the very mechanisms that you're using, and find ways to test those mechanisms against what you really want from the games that you play. This is whether you're talking about the genre, or you're talking about the thematic elements of the game, whether you're talking about the way or the tools that help you develop the plot. You want to find ways to consider other options, and roleplay roulette is one of them. The link to roleplay roulette will be here in the video as well, in the description below. But the style and flavor of the games that you play can be enhanced simply by finding new and inventive ways to play out the stories, especially those that are untold, because the mechanism you have currently in operation doesn't suit all of those options. So check all of that out. Enjoy your game of roleplay roulette, and again, get back to me and let me know what you think. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been Game Master's Guide, and I hope to see you next time. And by the way, go play.